A confirmatory factor analysis of the California Verbal Learning Test is second. Edition, CDLT2, in the standardization sample. Jacobus Donders. Mary Free Bed Rehabilitation Hospital, Grand Rapids. The purpose of this study is to determine the latent structure of the California Verbal Learning Test, second edition, CDLT2, Delhi, Kramer, Kaplan, and Over, 2000, at 3 different age levels, using the standardization sample. Maximum likelihood confirmatory FAC tour analyses are performed to test for competing hypothetical models for fit and parsimony. A four-factor model consisting of attention span, learning efficiency, delayed memory, and inaccurate memory provides the best fit to the data at 2 age levels, 16 to 30 years and 31 to 60 years, respectively, but the factor structure is somewhat less robust in the oldest age group, greater than 60 years. The results clarify the latent structure of the CDLT2 and suggest that a multifactorial interpretation of quantitative and qualitative indexes from this instrument is appropriate for clinical practice with most adults, although findings may need to be interpreted more cautiously among older persons. Keywords: learning, memory, construct validity, factor analysis, CDLT2. The California Verbal Learning Test, second edition, CDLT2, Delhi, Kramer, Kaplan, and Over, 2000, is a test of learning and memory in individuals ranging from 16 to 89 years. It includes indexes of both quantitative, e.g., number of words recalled, and qualitative, e.g., memorize a time strategy, aspects of these cognitive abilities. Compared to the original version of the instrument, Delhi, Kramer, Kaplan, and Over, 1987, the CDLT2 was revised substantially. For example, the CDLT2 was standardized on a normative sample that was much more representative of current national demographic characteristics, Delhi et al., 2000. In addition, some of the component indices of SPE-specific cognitive processes, like semantic clustering, were modified or expanded, Stricker, Brown, Wicksted, Baldo, and Delhi, 2002, and a trial pertaining to effort and motivation was also added, Moore and Donders, 2004. The reliability of the CDLT2 also appears to be acceptable, with value ease of internal consistency ranging from 0.78 to 0.94 across all ages, Delhi et al., 2000. In addition, there is support for the criterion validity of the CDLT2 in patients with various neurological conditions, Baldo, Delhi, Kramer, and Shimomura, 2002, Delhi et al., 2005, Donders and Nienhuis, 2007. When using a psychometric test in clinical practice, it is important that research be conducted to ensure that there is sufficient evidence for its construct validity. American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and National Council on Measurement in Education, 1999. The general goal is to ensure that test variables reflect accurately the intended. This research was supported by a grant from the Campbell Foundation. The author thanked Harcourt Assessment Incorporated for access to the California Verbal Learning Test, second edition national sample. This research was based on standardization data of the California Verbal Learning Test, second edition, CDLT2. Copyright 2000 by Harcourt Assessment Incorporated, used with permission. All rights reserved. California Verbal Learning Test and CDLT are trademarks of Harcourt Assessment Incorporated, registered in the United States of America and other jurisdictions. Correspondence regarding this article should be sent to Dr. Jacobus Donders, Psychology Service, Mary Free Bed Rehabilitation Hospital, 235 Wealthy SE, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49503. Email, jacobus.donders@maryfree.com. Assessment, Volume 15, Number 2, June 2008, 123 to 131 DOI, 10.1177/10731911073100926. Copyright 2008 Sage Publications. Downloaded from asm.sagepub.com at McGill University Library on April 2nd, 2015. Construct rather than something different. The specific purpose of the current investigation was to evaluate the latent structure of the CDLT2 at various age levels in the standardization sample. For this purpose, four different hypothetical models were compared using confirmatory factor analysis. The CDLT2 manual provides information on the results of an exploratory principal components analysis that was performed on 19 CDLT2 variables, yielding a 6-component solution in the standardization sample. The first component was labeled general verbal learning and consisted of the following 9 variables: list a trial 1 CO or rect, list a trial 5 correct, consistency across trials 1 to 5, trial B correct, short delay free recall correct, short delay queued recall correct, long delay free recall correct, long delay queued recall correct, and total recognition discriminability. The second component, response discrimination, included 3 variables: free recall, intrusions, queued recall intrusions, and total response. Bias. The third, fourth, and fifth components were each defined by two variables: organizational strategies by serial clustering forward and semantic clustering, primacy recency effects by percentage recall from, respectively, the primary region and the recency region, and recall efficiency by total repetitions and subjective clustering. Finally, the sixth component, acquisition rate, included only one variable: slope across trials 2 to 5. The test authors cautioned that constructs generated by factor analytic studies in non-clinical individuals may mask important cognitive distinctions that may become apparent only in specific, homogeneous clinical patient groups. Delis et al., 2000. Nevertheless, it is still important to understand the construct validity of an instrument in the standardization sample, given that clinically used norms are based on this sample, and because otherwise there would be no reference point to which latent variable models obtained in clinical samples could be compared. Unfortunately, there were a number of drawbacks to the procedures that the test authors used. First of all, principal components analysis may be helpful when the goal is reduction of variable redundancy, but it does not account for the various sources of variance and is therefore unlikely to reflect the latent structure of a test instrument. Wideman, 1993. Second, the apparent use of an orthogonal rotation does not account for the fact that several constructs, measured by the same instrument, are likely correlated to a meaningful degree. Preacher and McCallum, 2003. Third, the test authors included some variables that were interdependent, with the value of one variable being strongly dependent on that of at least one other variable in the group, which may lead to unstable estimates. Donders, 1999. For example, in the complete standardization sample, semantic clustering and serial clustering forward are moderately inversely related, R equals minus 0.38, P less than 0.0001. Moreover, it is almost impossible to score high, e.g., z greater than 2, on the former variable while at the same time exceeding the mean, i.e., z greater than 0, on the latter. In fact, only one person in the entire standardization sample did so. Fourth, one of the identified components, acquisition rate, consisted of only one variable, which raises concerns about reliability. Hatcher, 1994. Finally, the authors did not examine performance across different age bands. This is potentially problematic, given the well-known influence of aging on memory. Gomez-Perez and Ostrowski-Solis, 2006. Kempson-Newson, 2006. Shaw, Helms, and Mitchell, 2006. It is important to understand whether a test that is intended for use with individuals ranging from 16 to 89 years measures the same latent constructs at different ages. American Educational Research Association et al., 1999. For all these reasons, an examination of the latent struct tour of the CDLT2 at different age levels in the standardization sample using confirmatory factory analysis was indicated. Confirmatory factor analysis is a variant of structural equation modeling based on theoretical models that need to be specified a priori, which reduces the risk of capitulation on chance fluctuations. This method allows for evaluation of objective statistical criteria regarding the relative fit and parsimony of various competing hypothesized cow models concerning constructs that may be measured by a test like the CDLT2. It was considered important to include in this investigative variables measuring level of recall, as well as variables pertaining to learning strategy because the CDLT2 was specifically developed to investigate both quantitative and qualitative aspects of learning and memory. In addition, it was decided a priori that A. Interdependency should be avoided, B. Only variables for which z-scores were available should be included to allow direct comparability of the scores, and C. All variables should have satisfactory sampling distribution characteristics, defined as values greater than or equal to 0.80 on Kaiser's measure of sampling adequacy. The same criteria were applied previously in an investigation of the latent structure of the children's version of the instrument, Donders, 1999. On the basis of these criteria, 13 variables were selected, which were then included in the evaluation of the fit and parsimony of 4 competing latent variable models. Table 1 summarizes these models. Model 1 consisted of a single general memory factor. This model was considered potentially viable because it is the most parsimonious explanation for performance on the CDLT2, much like a full-scale IQ is often considered a useful index of overall ability on a test of psychometric intelligence, Kaufman and Lichtenberger, 1999. Model 2 was a two-factor model that consisted of accurate memory, 11 variables, and inaccurate memory. 124 assessment. Downloaded from asm.sagehub.com at McGill University Library on April 2nd, 2015. 2 variables. This model was specified because of the theoretical as well as practical importance of evaluating not only items correctly recalled, but also recall errors such as intrusions during free or cued recall, or false positives under a multiple choice recognition format, Amieva, Lafont, Rainville, Jartie, and Fabregal, 1998, Barba et al., 2002, Kint, Van Den Hout, and Buck, 2005. Model 3 was a three-factor model that consisted of immediate memory, 6 variables, delayed memory, 5 variables, and inaccurate memory, 2 variables. This model was considered because of the relevance of the distinction between immediate and delayed memory in various clinical samples, Delis, Jacobson, Bondi, Hamilton, and Salmon, 2003, Lang, Kalun, Taylor, Woodward, and Heaton, 2006, even though this has not been universally successful with other memory tests in various clinical samples, Bell, Herman, and Seidenberg, 2004, Burton, Ryan, Axelrod, Schellenberger, and Richards, 2003. Model 4 was a four-factor model which tested the hypothesis that repetition of information after only one presentation would be better classified as reflecting span of attention and could be differentiated from consolidated recall of information, similar to what has been found in standardization samples of other adults, Burton et al., 2003, and pediatric, Burton, Donders, and Middenberg, 1996, memory tests. Specifically, Model 4 hypothesized the presence of attention span, 3 variables, learning efficiency, 3 variables, delayed memory, 5 variables, and inaccurate memory, 2 variables, factors. Additional models that further separated delayed memory into short delay versus long delay or free versus queued recall constructs were not considered to be feasible because this resulted in problems with collinearity. For the same reason, models that split inaccurate memory into either free versus queued or immediate versus delayed recall intrusions were also not included. The six-factor model that the test authors presented in the manual was attempted, but it failed to converge because of a variety of statistical problems, including Haywood cases and factor intercorrelations approximating 1.00. This reflects the impact of interdependence of variables and the instability of a one-variable FAC toward in that model, as discussed above. For these reasons, data from that model are not presented here. Method. Participants. The CDLT2 standardization sample was used for this study. This sample is fairly representative of the population of the United States in terms of education level, ethnicity, gender, and geographic region, with exclusion of persons with self-reported neurological or psychiatric disorders. See Delis et al., 2000, for details. However, 11 of the 1,087 individuals, about 1%, in the standardization sample were identified on the basis of extremely low probability densities, p less than 0.0001, as outliers and were excluded from this investigation. All analyses were based on the remaining 1,076 participants. To evaluate the latent structure of the CDLT2 at different ages, the sample was divided into 3 age bands: young, ages 16 to 30 years, N equals 357, middle, ages 31 to 60 years, N equals 331, and old, ages 61 to 89 years, N equals 388. These groupings were chosen because they allowed for sizable, i.e., N greater than 300, as well as comparable numbers of partici. Hence, in each group, less than or equal to 15% difference in group size. The 3 age bands represent approximately the respective ODs of final educational and work entry experiences, both of vocational career and retirement. Similar age groups have also been compared in other studies with different memory tests, Burton et al., 2003, Wexler, 1997b. Materials. The CDLT2 is an individually administered test of the ability to learn and remember verbally presented information. It involves the oral presentation of 2 word lists, each containing 16 items, including 4 words from each of 4 semantic categories. There are 5 trials of full presentation and immediate recall of the first list, A, followed by a one-time presentation and immediate recall of a second interference list, B. Measures of free recall and semantically cued recall of list A are obtained immediately after the list B trial, and again after a 20-minute delay during which non-verbal tasks are administered. Then, a recognition trial is Donders/CDLT2 confirmatory factor analysis 125. Table 1 hypothetical latent variable models for the CDLT2 in the standardization sample. CDLT2 variable model 1 model 2 model 3 model 4. List A, trial 11111 list A. Trial 51112 list, B1111 short delay free recall, 1123 short delay queued recall, 1123 long delay free recall, 1123 long delay queued recall, 1123 semantic clustering, 1112 middle region, recall 1111 recall consistency, 1112 total intrusions, 1234 recognition, hits 1123 recognition, false positives, 1234. Note, CDLT2 equals California Verbal Learning Test, 2nd edition. Downloaded from asm.sagepub.com at McGill University Library on April 2nd, 2015. Presented on which the examinee is asked to identify the 16 items from List A from a larger list that contains 32 distractor items. Some of these distractor items are from the same semantic category but also contain the original target items from list A, some from list B, and some unrelated words. Overall performance on the CBLT2 is characterized in terms of a summary t-score, M equals 50, SD equals 10, reflecting level of immediate recall over the 5 successive trials of the first list, with higher scores reflecting better performance. In addition, the instrument allows for the computed time of numerous z-scores, M equals 0, SD equals 1, for a variety of other qualitative and quantitative variables. These T and Z scores are based on norms that are stratified by both age and gender. Procedure. 13 CBLT2 variables were included in this INVIES citation. These are the same variables that were previously included in confirmatory factor analyses of the children's version of the instrument in the standardization sample, Donders, 1999, and in a clinical sample, Mottram and Donders, 2005. All these variables had values of Kaiser's measure of sampling adequacy that equaled or exceeded 0.85, composite value equals 0.92. List A1 reflects the total words correctly recalled on the first trial of the first list, whereas list A5 is based on the total words correctly recalled on the last trial of that list. List B reflects the total words correctly recalled from the second list. Short delay free recall represents the total words correctly recalled on the short delay free recall trial of list A, i.e., immediately after completion of list B, and short delay queued recall represents the total words correctly recalled on the immediately following semantically. Queued recall trial of list A, long delay free recall is based on the total words correctly recalled on the 20-minute delayed free recall trial of list A, whereas long delay queued recall is based on the total words correctly recalled on the subsequent semantically queued recall trial of that list. Semantic clustering is a composite index of the qualitative aspects of learning style across the 5 trials of list A, specifically the degree to which the examinee recalls successive words belonging to the same semantic category. This is a variable that reflects an active and adaptive memorization strategy. Middle region is an index of the percentage of correct words recalled from the middle 8 words, summed across trials 1 to 5 of list A, which reflects the ability to keep information in working memory beyond just the first, primacy, or last, recency, items that were presented. Consistency represents the percentage of correct words consistently recalled across the consecutive presentations of list A. This reflects an organized and dependable level of processing information. Total intrusions is based on the complete number of incorrect words during all free and queued recall trials. Recognition hits represents the number of hits during the yes, no recognition trial, whereas false positives reflects the number of incorrectly endorsed items during that trial. The z-scores for all these 13 variables were used in the statistical analyses. Higher z-scores represent better performance on all variables except total intrusions and false positives. Given anticipated shared error variance between the short and long delayed recall variables, an a priori decision was made to allow the error terms for these variables, i.e., between short delay free recall and long delay free recall, and between short delay queued recall and long delay queued recall, to correlate in the 3 and 4 factor models. Inspection of variance inflation factors did not reveal problems with collinearity among any of them. Other variables. Normality checks with the Shapiro-Wilk. Statistic revealed that although most variables were normally distributed, some were not. For example, the variable semantic clustering was clearly positively skewed, whereas the variable middle region was negatively skewed. Given the theoretical importance of including not only variables of numbers of words recalled, but also of learning style, and considering the fact that these 2 variables were hypothesized to load on different factors in the 4-factor model, it was decided to retain them in the analyses. Using the SAS Police Procedure, SAS Institute, 1990, maximum likelihood confirmatory factor analyses were conducted for each of the 4 specified models, in each of the 3 age groups, i.e., young, middle, and old. Complete agreement is not present in the literature as to which are the most acceptable criteria for model fit and parsimony. For reviews, see Arnaud and Thompson, 2000, Brown and Kudek, 1993, Fan and Sibo, 2005. Hatcher, 1994, Hu and Bettler, 1999. However, the following IMG minimum standards appear to have fairly broad Emperor-Eichel support. Comparative fit index greater than or equal to 0.95. Parsimonious normed fit index greater than or equal to 0.60. Root mean squared error of approximation less than or equal to 0.06. And Tucker-Lewis index greater than or equal to 0.95. These 4 criteria were therefore specified a priori as desirable for the final models. Results. It was important to determine first that the 3 age groups were comparable in gender composition because the z-scores for the variables in the theoretical models are based on norms that are stratified not by only age, but also by gender. These findings are presented in Table 2. As can be seen in this table, there were no statistically significant 126 assessment. Downloaded from asm.sagepub.com at McGill University Library on April 2nd, 2015. Differences between the three age groups in gender, Chi2, N equals 1076, equals 4.67, P greater than 0.09. None of the 1 dash, 2 dash, or 3-factor models met the a priori specified criteria for acceptability, i.e., comparative fit index greater than or equal to 0.95, parsimonious normed fit index greater than or equal to 0.60, root mean squared error of approximation less than or equal to 0.06, and Tucker-Lewis index greater than or equal to 0.95. In any of the three age groups. Point 1 Table 3 presents the statistical results for the 4-factor model in each of the age groups. Inspection of this table suggests that the 4-factor model met all the desired criteria for model fit and parsimony in the young and middle age groups, but findings were less robust in the old age group. However, even in the latter cohort, 2 of the 4 criteria were met, and the findings were very close on the other 2. Furthermore, the 4-factor model had better values of all indexes than did the 3-factor model, which was the next closest. For these Aurier sums, the 4-factor model was considered to provide the relatively best fit to the data at all age levels. The 4 latent constructs in the final model included attention span, learning efficiency, delayed memory, and inaccurate memory. The variables contributing to each of these factors in each of the age groups are presented in Table 4. All the associated factor loadings equaled or exceeded 0.44, and they were all statistically significant, p less than 0.01, supporting the predicted relationships between the CDLT2 variables and the hypothesized latent factors. The composite reliabilities of the 4 factors ranged from a low of 0.51 for attention span in the old age group to a high of 0.92 for delayed memory in the middle age group. Values greater than or equal to 0.60 are typically desirable, Hatcher, 1994, so the reliability of the attention span construct is suboptimal in 2 of the age groups, whereas all the other latent factors have adequate to excellent reliability in all age groups. Table 5 presents the intercorrelations among the 4 hypothesized latent constructs by age group. These demon straight acceptable amounts of shared variance among them. Factors ranging from 15% between attention span and inaccurate memory in the middle age group to 72% between learning efficiency and delayed memory in the young age group. The fact that all correlations with the inaccurate memory factor are negative is because better performance on the variables that comprise this factor is reflected by negative z-scores, whereas better performance on all the other 11 CDLT2 variables is reflected in positive z-scores. Discussion. The purpose of this investigation was to determine which of 4 hypothesized models provided the relatively best fit to the data, with an acceptable degree of parsimony, for selected CDLT2 variables at different age levels in the standardization sample. The results support a 4FAC4 model comprising attention span, learning efficiency, delayed memory, and inaccurate memory. These findings provide an alternative, more parsimonious, and statistically more robust model of interpretation of CDLT2 test findings compared to the principal components analysis in the test manual, Delis et al., 2000. The findings were most convincing in the young, 16 to 30 years, and middle, 31 to 60 years, age groups, whereas the factor structure was somewhat less robust in the old, greater than 60 years, cohort. Difficulties with maintaining the same factor structure at older age levels have also been noted in standardization samples of other commonly used psychometrics. Tests, such as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 3rd edition, Weight 3, Wechsler, 1997A. With regard to the CDLT2, this probably reflects the fact that memory for new information is relatively more susceptible to the effects of aging than some other cognitive functions that are relatively more crystallized. Gomez-Perez and Ostrowski-Solis, 2006, Kempson-Newson, 2006, Shaw et al., 2006. This influence of aging on memory may not be uniform, causing more variability and less consistency in psychometric tests. Donders/CDLT2 confirmatory factor analysis 127. Table 2 characteristics of 3 age groups. Young middle old variable, n equals 357, n equals 331, n equals 388. Age years Dem SD 21.76, 4.79, 44.08, 8.86, 73.79, 7.41, gender N percent. Female 172, 48.18, 168, 50.76, 217, 55.93, male 185, 51.82, 163, 49.24, 171, 44.07. Note, CDLT2 equals California Verbal Learning Test, second edition. Findings are based on standardization data of the California Verbal Learning Test, second edition, CDLT2. Copyright 2000 by Harcourt Assessment Incorporated, used by permission. All rights reserved. Table 3 goodness of fit and parsimony statistics for 4-factor CDLT2 model by age group. Group Chi 2 DSP CFI PNFI RMSEA TLI. Young, N equals 357, 140.0257 less than 0.0010.970.690.060.95 middle, N equals 331, 132.3557 less than 0.0010.970.690.060.96 old, N equals 388. 187.4557 less than 0.0010.950.680.080.93. Note, CDLT2 equals California Verbal Learning Test, second edition. CFI equals Comparative Fit Index. PNFI equals Parsimonious Normed Fit Index. RMSEA equals Root Mean Squared Error of Approximation. TLI equals Tucker-Lewis Index. Findings are based on standardization data of the California Verbal Learning Test, second edition, CDLT2. Copyright 2000 by Harcourt Assessment Incorporated, used by permission. All rights reserved. Downloaded from asm.sagepub.com at McGill University Library on April 2nd, 2015. Scores and, as a result, diminished differentiation of specific latent constructs. Consistent with this interpretation, values of coefficient alpha were found to be uniformly lower at the oldest extreme, ages greater than 80 years, 0.64 to 0.71. Than at the youngest extreme, ages less than 20 years, 0.71 to 0.93, in the CDLT2 standardization sample. For these reasons, the factor structure will need to be interpreted with some greater caution with individuals who are older than 60, likely requiring more than just modest, e.g., 1ST, contrasts in performance across the various dimensions before. Firm conclusions are reached. Otherwise, minor variations across CDLT2 variables could be misinterpreted as reflect IMG divergent learning and memory processes, whereas such differences may not be sufficiently reliable in the old-old. The correlations among the 4 factors in this investigative suggested between 15% and 72% of shared variance. Consequently, these factors should not be considered as independent of each other. The implication for clinical practice is that differences between variables apparently. 128 assessment. Table 4 standardized coefficients and reliability for the CDLT2 4-factor model for young, Y, N equals 357, middle, M, N equals 331, and old, O, N equals 388 age groups. Factors. Attention span learning efficiency, delayed recall, inaccurate recall. CDLT2 variable YMO. List A. Trial 1 0.60, 0.65, 0.60, list B 0.59, 0.60, 0.44, middle region, recall 0.460. Note, CDLT scores and, as a result, diminished differentiation of specific latent constructs. Consistent with this interpretation, values of coefficient alpha were found to be uniformly lower at the oldest extreme, ages greater than 80 years, 0.64 to 0.71. Than at the youngest extreme, ages less than 20 years, 0.71 to 0.93, in the CDLT2 standardization sample. For these reasons, the factor structure will need to be interpreted with some greater caution with individuals who are older than 60, likely requiring more than just modest, e.g., 1ST, contrasts in performance across the various dimensions before. Firm conclusions are reached. Otherwise, minor variations across CDLT2 variables could be misinterpreted as reflect IMG divergent learning and memory processes, whereas such differences may not be sufficiently reliable in the old-old. The correlations among the 4 factors in this investigative suggested between 15% and 72% of shared variance. Consequently, these factors should not be considered as independent of each other. The implication for clinical practice is that differences between variables apparently. 128 assessment. Table 4 standardized coefficients and reliability for the CDLT2 4-factor model for young, Y, N equals 357, middle, M, N equals 331, and old, O, N equals 388 age groups. Factors. Attention span learning efficiency, delayed recall, inaccurate recall. CDLT2 variable YMO. List A. Trial 1 0.60, 0.65, 0.60, List B 0.59, 0.60, 0.44, Middle Region, Recall 0.46, 0.46, 0.47, List A. Trial 5 0.89, 0.92, 0.92, Semantic Clustering 0.47, 0.56, 0.49. Loading on different factors should only be interpreted within the context of additional psychometrics, observational, or other evidence that supports such a conclusion. For example, a selective deficit on CDLT2 variables pertaining to delayed memory in the context of normal performance on variables associated with the attention span factor might suggest a specific deficit in consolidated verbal memory as opposed to difficulties with attention or executive functioning. Such an interpretation would be bolstered if the same individual had normal scores on the Working Memory Index of the Wechsler Memory Scale, 3rd edition, Wechsler, 1997b, although doing poorly on the Auditory Delayed Index of that same instrument. The somewhat modest reliability of the attention span factor suggests that some caution is necessary in interpret ing variables associated with that construct. A similar pattern, i.e., with composite reliability of the other factors, being relatively higher, has been noted previously in Kahn. Confirmatory factor analysis studies in clinical samples with the pediatric version of the CDLT2, Mottram and Donders, 2005, as well as with the original adult version of the instrument, Wiedner and Donders, 1999. Part of the reason may be that two of the component variables reflect performance after only a one-time exposure to the information, either list A or list B, whereas the other variables included in this investigation reflect performance on variables that were all obtained after that same information had been repeated several times. In any event, the relatively modest reliability of the attention span construct only reinforces the need to consider CDLT2 variables in concert with other psychometric test findings before making firm conclusions about a person's cognitive abilities. The fact that this investigation found psychometric support for delayed memory as a distinct construct is important because that has been an elusive goal in some previous investigations with different instruments such as the Wechsler Memory Scale, 3rd edition, Bell et al., 2004, Burton et al., 2003. As the CDLT2 test authors have indicated, this distinction is often important in the evaluation of clinical patients, such as those with various forms of neurologically based amnesia or dementia, Delis et al., 2000. Separation of accurate recollection from recall errors is also a potentially important consideration in the assessment of learning and memory, Delis et al., 2005. It should be noted that the inaccurate memory construct in this investigation was defined by only two variables, whereas three or more variables are often desirable in factor analysis. However, hypothetical models should be judged not only by statistical, but also by theoretical criteria. Research with other instruments has indicated that some two-variable factor indexes, such as the processing speed index from the Wave3, have considerable construct and criterion validity in clinical samples, e.g., Martin, Donders, and Thompson, 2000, Van der Heijden and Donders, 2003. For this reason, the inaccurate memory construct appears to be a potentially useful part of interpretation of CDLT2 findings. The current findings suggest that qualitative or process variables, e.g., semantic clustering, as well as quantitative variables, e.g., recognition hits and false positives, contribute meaningfully to the final factor model. This contrasts with previous findings in the standardization sample of the pediatric version of the CDLT2, Donders, 1999, where variables of learning strategies such as semantic clustering fared much worse than the quantitative indexes. This difference may be because of the fact that as part of the Revy-Schaun process, the computation of these qualitative variables was altered to make them psychometrically stronger and theoretically more meaningful, Stricker et al., 2002. Potential limitations of this investigation must also be considered. Some recent test instruments include a FIPA, Rate Recognition Memory Index, Chieslow and Adams, 2003. Evaluation of such a factor was not possible in this INDIES citation because there is only one single CDLT2 variable pertaining to accurate recognition memory, and single variable factors are typically unreliable. It could also be argued that inclusion of other CDLT2 variables might have generated different results. However, it needs to be realized that the current variables were selected on the basis of specific theoretical and pragmatic criteria, without problems associated with interdependency or collinearity, or having single variable factors. With these reservations in mind, and while being mindful of the need to seek supporting information from independent psychometric or other assessment findings, some provisional clinical guidelines can be offered with regard to multifactorial interpretation of CDLT2 findings. Performance on List A1, List B, and Middle Region may reflect primarily the integrity of span of attention, or the ability to hold new information in one's head for immediate further processing. The list A5, semantic clustering, and consistency variables may indicate the degree to which a person is spontaneously using effective learning strategies. The short and long, free and few, delayed recall variables, in concert with recognition hits, may provide important information about the degree to which previously learned information has been consolidated and can be recalled or retrieved. Finally, the total intrusions and false positives variables may be contrasted with the variables of accurate recall to examine the degree to which a person's recollection of original target material is confounded by plausible but erroneous or even irrelevant information. It should also be noted that it is not completely unusual for individuals to have considerable discrepancies in performance on variables that are thought to be related to the same. Underlying construct. For example, in a recent investigation, Donders/CDLT2 Confirmatory Factor Analysis 129, downloaded from asm.sagepub.com at McGill University Library on April 2, 2015. It was determined that more than a quarter of the CDLT2 standardization sample had a discrepancy between list A1 and list B in either direction that exceeded a standard deviation. Donders, 2006. When such patterns are encountered, here, alternative methods of interpretation should probably be considered. For example, consideration of a proactive interference effect if the z-score on list B is considerably worse than on list A1. A goal for future research is evaluation of the degree to which this four-factor structure can also account for the variability in performance on the CDLT2 in clinical samples, such as persons with dementia or traumatic brain injury. Another opportunity for additional research is to determine whether specific subtypes of learning and memory can be identified based on these four factors in both the standardization sample and in clinical samples. Note 1. Details about the goodness of fit and parsimony indexes of the 1-, 2-, and 3-factor models are available from the author on request. References: American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and National Council on Measurement in Education. 1999, Standards for Education. Abstract. We have recently reported, Sekin et al., 1999b, selective activation of left medial temporal lobe structures during processing of novel compared to familiar words using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. The current study describes the relationship between a widely used clinical test of verbal learning, the California Verbal Learning Test, CVLT, and the previously reported fMRI activations. 13 right-handed healthy adult participants were studied with whole brain echoplanar fMRI while listening to novel and recently learned, familiar, words intermixed pseudo-randomly in an event-related design. These participants were also tested with the CVLT. Scores for CVLT Trial 1, immediate encoding of novel words, and recognition discriminability, recognition of familiar versus novel words, were correlated with fMRI signal change during processing of novel versus familiar words using a covariance model implemented in SPM96. For the novel words analysis, voxels in the right anterior hippocampus correlated significantly with Trial 1, are 5.76 at the maxima. For the recognition analysis, a significant cluster of voxels was found in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, are 5.88 at the maxima. Our prior results of separable left medial temporal activation to novel and familiar words, together with results of the covariance analyses reported here, suggest that in addition to the left medial temporal lobe, MTL, regions that are engaged during novel and familiar word processing, the right hippocampus and right frontal lobe are also involved, particularly in those participants with better memory ability. This positive relationship between fMRI activation and CVLT performance suggests the role for these right hemisphere regions in successful memory processing. We have recently reported, Sekin et al., 1999b, selective activation of left medial temporal lobe structures during processing of novel compared to familiar words using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. The current study describes the relationship between a widely used clinical test of verbal learning, the California Verbal Learning Test, CVLT, and the previously reported fMRI activations. 13 right-handed healthy adult participants were studied with whole brain echoplanar fMRI while listening to novel and recently learned, familiar, words intermixed pseudo-randomly in an event-related design. These participants were also tested with the CVLT. Scores for CVLT Trial 1, immediate encoding of novel words, and recognition discriminability, recognition of familiar versus novel words, were correlated with fMRI signal change during processing of novel versus familiar words using a covariance model implemented in SPM96. For the novel words analysis, voxels in the right anterior hippocampus correlated significantly with trial 1, or 5.76 at the maxima. For the recognition analysis, a significant cluster of voxels was found in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or 5.88 at the maxima. Our prior results of separable left medial temporal activation to novel and familiar words, together with results of the covariance analyses reported here, suggest that in addition to the left medial temporal lobe, MTL, regions that are engaged during novel and familiar word processing, the right hippocampus and right frontal lobe are also involved, particularly in those participants with better memory ability. This positive relationship between fMRI activation and CDLT performance suggests the role for these right hemisphere regions in successful memory processing of verbal material, perhaps reflecting more efficient encoding and retrieval strategies that facilitate memory. Genes, 2001, 7, 55-62. Keywords, functional MRI, verbal memory, hippocampus, CDLT. Introduction. New functional neuroimaging techniques, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, provide an off-port unity to examine the relationship between clinical neuropsychological measures of memory and neural activity. In this study, we correlated neural activation during two important aspects of verbal memory, processing novel words and recognizing familiar words, to performance on a clinical neuropsychological test of verbal memory. This is a secondary analysis of prior work that demonstrated differential left medial temporal lobe fMRI activation to novel and familiar word types. Novel words activated the left anterior hippocampus, and familiar words activated the left posterior parahippocampal gyrus and right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Saykin et al., 1999b. Functional imaging studies have consistently found active ion of the right prefrontal cortex in episodic memory retrieval. Fletcher et al., 1998, Tolving et al., 1994, and the mesial temporal lobes and left frontal lobe in encoding. Leftage et al., 1998. Our prior study, Saykin et al., 1999b, upon which this report is based, also found that processing novel and previously learned verbal information can be dissociated within the left medial temporal lobe, MTL. A similar reprint requests and correspondence to Andrew J. Saykin, Brain and Aging Laboratory, Psychiatry, Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, Lebanon, NH03756. Email, saykin@dartmouth.edu. Journal of the International Neuropsychological Society, 2001, 7, 55-62. Copyright 2001 INS. Published by Cambridge University Press. Printed in the USA. 55. Finding has been observed in two other recent fMRI studies, Dolan and Fletcher, 1999, Strange et al., 1999, but not all studies have agreed, Gabrielli et al., 1997. Results of our prior study are consistent with positron emission to MOGRA PHY, PET, activation studies, LePage et al., 1998, and Lashoun studies, Corkin et al., 1997, of memory. The California Verbal Learning Test, CDLT, Delis et al., 1987, a popular neuropsychological measure of verbal learn ing and memory, has been shown to be sensitive to medial temporal lobe functioning after temporal lobectomy, Herman et al., 1992, and in Alzheimer's disease, Fox et al., 1998, and is related to hippocampal volume in Alzheimer's disease, Dewar et al., 1995, Ligon et al., 1998. On this test, the participant is presented with a 16-item word list over 5 trials and then tested for recall and recognition after a delay. In the present study, we examined the correlational RELA time shift between two CDLT variables and fMRI signal change during a related word memory task. As above, the main effects for this fMRI task have been previously reported, Saykin et al., 1999b. The CDLT variables were trial 1, number of words correctly recalled, an indicator of novel word encoding, and the recognition discrimination score, recognition of familiar versus novel words, presumed to include retrieval 0 matching processes. The fMRI variables were relative brain activity during novel word processing and familiar word processing. The correlational analysis reported here addresses a somewhat different question than typical activation studies that examine signal increase relative to a baseline condition during cognitive stimulation. Bandettini and Wong, 1997. Krakowiak and Friston, 1994. Friston, 1997. The purpose of this covariate analysis was to assess the relationship between the magnitude of fMRI signal changed to familiar or novel words and performance on an independent measurement of memory performance. In this case, CDLT data gathered outside the scanner. 4a. Review of the covariate modeling methodology, see Friston et al., 1995. This technique has often been employed in PET studies, and examples of the technique are found in several recent reports. Musso et al., 1999, Peterson et al., 1999a-b, Sakin et al., 1999a. We hypothesized that the trial 1 score would correlate with neural systems subserving initial encoding or novelty processing, including the anterior MTL and frontal regions, whereas the CBLT discriminability score would correlate with neural systems underlying retrieval processes in CLUD-ING, the right prefrontal cortex, and posterior MTL regions. Methods. Participants. 13, 8 female, 5 male, right-handed healthy adults, mean age 530.66, 10.9 years, mean education 513.461.6 years, were screened with a structured clinical interview for DSM-4 and determined to be free of past or present history of neurological or axis-I psychiatric disorder. Participants underwent a brief cognitive evaluation, and these results, along with other demographics, are presented in Table 1. All participants provided written informed consent under an IRB-approved protocol. These participants were part of a larger sample of 16 that has been reported elsewhere, Sakin et al., 1999b, and were selected from this larger group based on availability of CBLT data. Activation task. As previously described, Sakin et al., 1999b, participants were asked to listen carefully to a 48-item word list of concrete nouns presented at a rate of 1 word every 6 sets. 10 of the words were memorized 1H before scanning, familiar words. The remaining 38 words were novel. The familiar. Table 1. Demographic and cognitive description of participants. Participant age, education, rat-free CBLT trial 1 items recalled. CBLT discriminability, percent. 139, 12, 102, 7, 98, 2, 2014, 113, 10, 100, 338, 12, 99, 95, 4, 1913, 114, 12, 105, 1914, 121, 7, 106, 31, 12, 107, 10, 957, 53, 12, 107, 7, 89, 8, 29, 16, 105, 5, 109, 29, 16, 114, 10, 93, 10, 19, 12, 116. 10, 93, 11, 21, 15, 108, 9, 98, 12, 40, 12, 93, 6, 91, 13, 41, 14, 113, 12, 98. A WRAT3, Reading Recognition from Wide Range Achievement Test, 3rd edition CBLT, California Verbal Learning Test. 56, S.C. Johnson et al. Words were pseudo-randomly positioned throughout the task, and these were always separated by at least 1 novel word. Familiar and novel words were equated on imagery and frequency values in the English language, Francis and Casera, 1982. Participants were tested for free recall of the word list immediately prior to scanning, and all were able to recite the entire list. Of note, during the scan, participants were only instructed to listen to the words. To avoid confounding the neural response to novel and familiar words with executive motor and decision-making processes, no overt behavioral response was elicited. Scan procedure. Scans were acquired using a 1.5 TGE Sigma scanner and a multi-axial local gradient head coil system, Medical Advances Inc. A single-shot gradient echoplanar S-sequence was used to provide whole brain coverage, TR5 3000 milliseconds, TE5 40 milliseconds, FOV 524 centimeters, 20 or 23 6 millimeters thick sagittal slices, yielding a 64-364 matrix with 3.75 mm in plane resolution. A time series of 98 T2 asterisk weighted volumes was acquired during the task. All scans were cropped to eliminate most non-brain box cells. Spatial realignment using a 6-parameter model was performed on all raw scan data prior to further analysis to remove any minor, subvoxel, motion-related signal change. The time series was reduced to mean conditioned images representing the 2 word types, novel and familiar, after offsetting by 1 TR to account for the lagged hemodynamic response. Mean images for each condition for each participant were spatially normalized to the standardized Talairach Atlas space. Using a 12-parameter affine approach and a T2 asterisk weighted template image, use of nonlinear warping by spatial basis functions was limited to 23232 and 8 iterations. Der-ING normalization, all scans were resampled to isotropic box Ls, 2mm3. Spatial smoothing using a Gaussian filter, full width half maximum 515 mm3, was then performed to reduce the effect of gyral variability across participants. Statistical analysis. Functional MRI analyses were performed with statistical parametric mapping on a voxel-by-voxel basis using a Gen-Earl linear model approach, Friston et al., 1995, as implemented in SPM 96, Wellcome Department of Cognitive Neurology, University College of London. The current analysis can be thought of as a correlational study, although the method of implementation was a univariate regression procedure at each voxel. In the SPM regression model, the covariate of interest was the interaction of CDLT performance and relative fMRI activation. The main effects of CDLT performance and fMRI activation alone were excluded as covariates of no interest. For the recognition analysis, the CDLT discriminability score was covariate with the fMRI signal increased to familiar words. For the novelty analysis, CDLT trial 1 was covariate with the fMRI signal increased to novel words. The results of these analyses were displayed on statistical maps of the brain showing the VOXLs where activation was significantly correlated with CDLT performance. A probability threshold of p.001 was SE left. For descriptive purposes, the Pearson correlation coefficients were also calculated for local maxima of the activated clusters in each condition. Results. Recognition of familiar words. This analysis resulted in a single focal area of significance in the right lateral prefrontal cortex. Figure 1 presents the covariance SPM. This is effectively a correlation map for these participants superimposed on a high-resolution STAN-DART atlas brain. The coordinates for the local maxima of the significant cluster X, Y, Z, 46, 24, 28 were located along the dorsal bank of the inferior frontal sulcus. The Pearson correlation coefficient at this location was R 5.88. The p-estimative correlation indicates that increased activation to familiar words was associated with a higher CDLT discriminability score. Figure 2 plots each participant's signal increased to familiar words as a function of CDLT discriminability score. A fitted regression line is superimposed on the plot. Novel words. The covariance SPM between signal change to novel words and CDLT trial 1 is presented in Figure 3. The region of peak positive correlation was in the right anterior hippocampus, X, Y, Z, 22, 26, 216. Figure 4 is a plot of the SIG-NAL change during novel word presentation and CDLT trial 1 scores and includes a regression line. The correlation coefficient at this cluster was R 5.76. Discussion. This study examined the relationship between performance on a standardized measure of learning and recognition and fMRI signal changed to familiar and novel words in 13 healthy normal adult participants. The CDLT discriminability score was positively correlated with fMRI signal increased to familiar words in the right prefrontal cortex, PFC. The p-estimative correlation between trial 1 and signal changed to novel words was significant in the right hippocampus. Typical activation studies examine regions of signal change during cognitive probes regardless of how well participants perform. For example, when we examined signal change alone for the same fMRI task reported here, Sakin et al., 1999b, we found separable neural systems for novel and familiar words involving the left medial temporal region and right prefrontal cortex. The current report departs from typical activation studies in an important way. These neuroanatomical correlates of CDLT performance 57. Activation maps represent the correlational relationship between degree of fMRI activation and performance on the CDLT, an indicator of verbal learning and recognition ability. It is important to note that these results do not contradict the material-specific hypothesis that verbal memory is a left hemisphere function. Indeed, our prior report described S-elective left MTL activations to both novel and familiar words in these same data. However, much of what is known regarding material specificity of memory is from patients with lesions, particularly mesial temporal sclerosis associated AD-lessy. The current results suggest potential differences in neural networks between the normal functioning brain and the lesioned brain. The main finding of this correlational analysis is that in addition to left MTL activation, healthy participants with better novel word processing ability also activate the right hippocampus and participants with better retrieval ability activate the right PFC. Processing familiar words. Activation of the right PFC during retrieval has been a consistent finding in recent functional imaging studies. Buckner and Kapstel, 1998, Buckner et al., 1998 AB, Fletcher et al., 1998. At least two related theories have been put forward to account for these findings: retrieval attempt and retrieval success. The retrieval attempt hypothesis, Cabeza et al., 1997, Nyberg et al., 1995, proposes that right prefrontal activation is associated with a cognitive set in which the brain attempts to retrieve past experience. The retrieval success hypothesis, Buckner et al., 1998b, Wright et al., 1996, suggests that increased activation during retrieval is associated with the accuracy of retrieval. Our current results suggest that a retrieval attempt cognitive set may not be sufficient to account for the relationship between activation and performance. At the very least, these. Figure 1. Statistical parametric map of covariance between between fMRI signal change to familiar words, familiar, novel, and CDLT discriminability score. The sole cluster of significant voxels was in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Uncorrected probability threshold, p. 0.001. 58 S.C. Johnson et al. Correlational results suggest that retrieval success is related to the degree of fMRI signal change in the right frontal lobe. It is important to note that activation studies and lesion studies of patients have not entirely agreed on the role of the right frontal cortex in retrieval. For example, Swick and Knight, 1996, 1999, found little to no decrement in retrieval performance in patients with frontal lesions. This AP-parent disparity between the functional imaging memory literature, see for example, Fletcher et al., 1998, Tolbing et al., 1994, and lesion literature will likely be resolved by well-designed neuroactivation studies directly contrasting normal participants with patients who have right frontal lesions. Processing novel words. The laterality of the finding of significant correlation in the right hippocampus with CDLT trial 1 was somewhat unexpected. Most activation studies of encoding for verbal material report left or bilateral findings. Indeed, for these same data, Sakin et al., 1999b, the main effects of activation for both novel and familiar words were in the left medial temporal region. These prior results make the current COR relational findings particularly intriguing. The result of a positive correlation in the right hippocampus between active ion to novel words in CDLT trial 1, together with our prior results, suggests that although the left hippocampus is generally engaged during encoding of new verbal informa, tie-in, the right hippocampus becomes increasingly involved with higher CDLT performance. This finding further suggests that participants with greater memory capacity engage the right as well as left hippocampus. This may reflect use of more elaborate encoding strategies such as imagery or the formation of more complex associations between words. It may also reflect other processes such as increased arousal and attention to the stimuli. However, we note that the source of our fMRI signal change was the direct comparison of the novel and familiar word conditions. This contrast was designed to effectively control for the attentional and language demands of the task, given that these were common to both conditions. Limitations. There are several methodological issues to be considered when interpreting these data. The variables reported here were from different contexts. One was the relative hemodynamic signal change during processing of different classes of word event types measured within an MRI scanner, and the other was performance scores on a standard neuropsychological instrument obtained in an office setting and used as a surrogate for fMRI task performance. An alternative approach would have been to administer the CDLT in the scanner. Unfortunately, the physical and technological constraints of fMRI make it difficult to convert clinical neuropsychological measures to fMRI cognitive probes at this time. Nonetheless, adapting. Figure 2. Plot of signal change to familiar words in CDLT discriminability score for the voxel at the crosshairs in Figure 1. This was the voxel of greatest statistical significance, Talairach coordinates 44, 24, 28. Neuroanatomical correlates of CDLT performance 59. Neuropsychological measures in this way will be important in gaining a better understanding of the neural systems involved in specific tests. Another consideration is that the fMRI task and the two CDLT tasks differed in terms of instructional set and presentation. In the CDLT trial 1, participants were instructed to learn the word list, whereas during the fMRI scan, participants were only told to listen to words. Further, on the CDLT words were presented about 1S apart, whereas in the fMRI task, words were presented as discrete events 6S apart. Despite these differences, both tasks involved auditory presentation of novel words and encoding processes. The tasks were more similar for the recognition comparison. However, the CDLT recognition discrimination score reflects recognition accuracy, whereas the fMRI data involves changes in neural activity associated with recently learned words. In our activation task, there were only 10 time events per scan condition that were analyzed. This may have reduced our power to detect significant activations and covariance relationships elsewhere in the brain. Medithica tie-ins to overcome these limitations are currently being evaluated in our laboratory. Conclusions. In conclusion, this study provides correlational evidence of right frontal and MTL participation in verbal memory. In the context of prior neuropsychological and cognitive neuroimaging results reporting that processing of novel and familiar verbal information is primarily a left hemisphere function, our results suggest that the success of those processes, as measured by performance level on the CDLT, may be mediated, in part, by regions in the right hemisphere. These correlational results require replication in additional normal participant samples. In view of the expanding application of fMRI to clinical populations with memory disorders, McAllister et al., 1999, Sakin et al., 1999a, 8. Figure 3. Statistical parametric map of covariance between fMRI signals changed to novel words, novel, familiar, and trial 1 of the CDLT. This cluster is in the anterior right hippocampus. Uncorrected probability threshold, p.001. 60 SC Johnson et al. Will be important for future studies to determine if the same pattern of ability zero activation relationships exists in clinical samples. Acknowledgements. This work was supported in part by grants from the National Institutes of Health, NS10563, National Institute of Disability and Rehabilitation Research, H133670031, National Alliance for Research on Schizophrenia and Affective Disorders, Alzheimer's Association, IIRG 94-133, Ira DeCamp Foundation, and the New Hampshire Hospital. The authors gratefully acknowledge Chad H. Morris, John D. Weaver, Ph.D., and Alexander Memorian, M.D., for assistance with the image acquisition and analysis, James C. Ford, Philia McDonn, Ph.D., and Charles B. Owen, Ph.D., for assistance with stimulus delivery software, Leslie C. Baxter, Ph.D., and Heather Richard, Ph.D. Criterion validity of the California Verbal Learning Test second. Edition, CDLT2, after traumatic brain injury. Monica L. Jacobs, Jacobus Donders after operator. Psychology Service, Mary Free Bed Rehabilitation Hospital, 235 Wealthy, SE, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49503, United States, accepted December 6, 2006. Abstract. The California Verbal Learning Test Second Edition, CDLT2, was performed by 200 participants, divided into moderate, severe traumatic brain injury, N equals 43, mild traumatic brain injury, N equals 57, and demographically matched control, N equals 100, groups. Participants with complicating premorbid histories or who scored below 15/16 on the CDLT2 forced choice recognition trial were excluded. There were statistically significant, p less than 0.0001, effects of group status on the CDLT2 total recall discriminability and recognition discriminability indices. Logistic regression revealed that, in the classification of control versus moderate, severe traumatic brain injury, CDLT2 variables were accurate 66 to 71% overall, but false positive rates ranged from 49 to 54%. In conclusion, average scores on the CDLT2 differ meaningfully between patients with various degrees of severity of traumatic brain injury and controls, but this test should not be used in isolation to determine the presence or absence of acquired memory impairment. Copyright 2006 National Academy of Neuropsychology. Published by Elsevier Limited. All rights reserved. Keywords: learning, memory, traumatic brain injury. The California Verbal Learning Test Second Edition, CDLT2, Delhi, Kramer, Kaplan, and Over, 2000, is an updated version of the original California Verbal Learning Test, CDLT, Delhi, Kramer, Kaplan, and Over, 1987, and is used to evaluate learning and memory in persons ranging in age from 16 to 89 years. The CDLT demonstrated sensitivity to a broad range of clinical conditions and has seen especially widespread application in the evaluation of sequelae of traumatic brain injury, TBI, Crossan, Novak, Trenery, and Craig, 1988, Curtis, Vanderflow, Spencer, and Salazar, 2001, Wiedner and Donders, 1999. Compared to its predecessor, innovations on the CDLT2 include the addition of a forced choice trial to assess level of effort, and the inclusion of recall discriminability indices, which are based not only on the number of correct words recalled but also take into account intrusions, i.e., words that were not from the original list. The reliability of the CDLT2 appears to be acceptable, with values of internal consistency ranging from 0.78 to 0.94, and the normative base is much more representative of the general U.S. population than that for the CDLT, Delhi et al., 2000. The goal of the current study was to assess the criterion validity of the CDLT2 in patients with TBI. Criterion validity pertains to whether or not a psychometric variable of interest is meaningfully related to a relevant, external dimension or standard, American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and National Council on Measurement, i.e. in Education, 1999. In this case, this has to do with whether or not asterisk operator corresponding author TEL +1 616 242 9201 fax +1 616 451 9513 Email address, jacobus.donders@maryfreed.com, jacobus.donders@maryfreed.com, J. Donders. 0887-6177/$. Secret Matter Copyright 2006 National Academy of Neuropsychology. Published by Elsevier Limited. All rights reserved. DOI 10.1016/J.ACN.2006.12.002. 144 ML Jacobs, J. Donders/Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology 22, 2007, 143 to 149. Scores on the CDLT-2 are related to the presence and severity of brain injury. Several recent studies have provided support for the potential utility of the CDLT-2 in various clinical samples. Baldo, Delis, Kramer, and S. Shimamura, 2002, examined the CDLT-2 profiles of 11 patients with focal frontal lobe lesions as compared to a control group. They found that the patients with frontal injuries learned fewer words, made more intrusion errors, and also had impaired yes/no recognition performance. Delis et al., 2005, compared the new recall discriminability indices to traditional scores, i.e., those based exclusively on target items correctly recalled, in the discrimination of patients with Huntington's disease and Alzheimer's disease. In their study, the recall discriminability indices distinguished the groups better, primarily because the patients with Alzheimer's disease made more intrusion errors, which affected the recall discriminability. Scores, but not the traditional indices of accurate recall. Neither of these two studies addressed the sensitivity, specificity, or general predictive value of the CDLT-2. Although such data was not germane to the primary goal of those studies, information about this kind of classification is typically more important for clinical practice than knowledge about differences between group means, Ibnik et al., 2001. Furthermore, to our knowledge, no studies have examined the criterion validity of the CDLT-2 in a large sample of patients with TBI. The purpose of the current investigation was to determine the extent of group differences in average performance on the CDLT-2 between patients with various degrees of severity of TBI and demographically matched controls, and also to provide more detailed information about diagnostic classification accuracy when trying to predict group membership on the basis of the CDLT-2. It has been well established that deficits in learning and memory are fairly common. After moderate to severe TBI, such as those injuries that are associated with prolonged loss of consciousness and/or acute intracranial lesions on neuroimaging, Hanks, Ricker, and Millis, 2004, Vakil, 2005. Both dominant temporal and prefrontal involvement may be especially detrimental in this regard, Baldo et al., 2002, Crossan, Sartor, Jenny, Neighbors, and Moberg, 1993. However, there is some controversy about the possibility of persisting cognitive difficulties in persons with mild, uncomplicated TBI, Bigler, 2001, Mittenberg and Stroman, 2000, Ruff, Comenzoli, and Mueller, 1996. Most recent literature reviews suggest that although some deficits in learning and memory may occur early in the recovery from mild TBI, i.e., without coma and with negative neuroimaging findings, it is unusual to have such difficulties persist for extended periods of time in the absence of premorbid or comorbid complicating factors such as psychiatric history or financial compensation seeking. Iverson, 2005, Larrabee, 2005, Shetland and Shapiro, 2003. Based on the above described literature, we hypothesized that 1. Patients with moderate, severe brain injury would have statistically significantly lower average scores on the CDLT-2 than either patients with mild TBI or demographically matched controls, and 2. The average CDLT-2 performance of patients with mild TBI would not be statistically significantly different from that of demographically matched controls. This was considered to be a first step in the establishment of criterion validity of the instrument. It was also determined a priori that, in order to be clinically useful as a tool in the classification of individual patients, the CDLT-2 should have a likelihood ratio, sensitivity/1 minus specificity, greater than or equal to 2. This has been suggested as a reasonable standard for clinical decision-making, particularly when there are no strong reasons to value sensitivity disproportionately higher than specificity, or vice versa, on a routine basis with a particular medical diagnosis, Grimes and Schultz, 2005. 1. Method. 1.1. Participants. After receiving Institutional Review Board approval, 100 clinical participants were obtained retrospectively from approximately 4 years of consecutive clinical referrals to a Midwestern rehabilitation facility. Candidates included in the study met the following criteria. 1. Diagnosis of TBI through external force to the head with associated alteration of consciousness. 2. Age between 17 and 80 years at the time of assessment. 3. Evaluation with the CDLT-2 within 1 year after injury. 4. Absence of a premorbid history of special education, substance abuse, neurological impairment, or psychiatric illness. 5. Performance in the valid range, i.e., score of at least 15/16 on the forced choice. Recognition Trial, A Measure of Effort and Motivation, Moore and Donders, 2004, and 6, not currently involved in disputed financial compensation seeking. Only 4 potential participants who had not already been excluded for ongoing litigation or prior psychiatric history were eliminated for failing the forced choice recognition trial of the CDLT-2. 3 of them had sustained mild injuries, as defined below, and only 1 had extended length of coma. All of the remaining participants also completed and passed 1 or more of the following measures of effort: word memory test, test of memory malingering, and or reliable digit span. Only initial evaluations were used in this study. During the course, M.L. Jacobs, J. Donders/Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology 22, 2007, 143 to 149, 145. Table 1 Demographic Characteristics of Control, N equals 100, mild TBI, N equals 57, and moderate, severe TBI, N equals 43, groups. Variable control, mild, moderate, severe. Age, years, M, SD, 35.25, 16.64, 37.33, 13.66, 32.09, 18.09, days since injury, M, SD, 122.53, 87.12, 99.47, 61.38. Gender, percent. Female 39.00, 43.86, 32.56. Male 61.00, 56.14, 67.44. Ethnicity, percent. African 8.007.022.33, Asian 0.001.752.33, Caucasian 87.00, 87.72, 93.02, Latino 5.00, 3.512.33. Education, percent, less than or equal to 11 years 19.00, 14.03, 39.53, 12 years 37.00, 36.84, 30.23, 13 to 15 years 29.00, 33.33, 13.95, greater than or equal to 16 years 15.00, 15.79, 16.28. Note: TBI, traumatic brain injury. Control data are from the standardization sample of the California Verbal Learning Test 2nd edition, CDLT-2. Copyright 2000 by Harcourt Assessment Incorporated, used with permission. All rights reserved. Of this investigation, the CDLT-2 was routinely included in neuropsychological assessments of patients with TBI at the facility where this research was completed, except under circumstances that would have invalidated the test results, e.g., not fluent in English. Most of the clinical participants have been injured in a motor vehicle accident as a driver, N equals 52, passenger, N equals 23, or pedestrian, N equals 2. Other injury conditions included falls, N equals 9, recreational activities, N equals 7, and other, N equals 7. The average time since injury at the time of assessment was 112.61 days, SD equals 77.61, range equals 28 to 346. Several potential measures of injury severity were initially considered, including the Glasgow Coma Scale, GCS, length of post-traumatic amnesia, PTA, and length of coma. GCS scores were often affected by sedation, and tended to be quite variable in the first 24 age, making this an unstable index of injury severity. Length of PTA needed to be estimated retrospectively in a considerable proportion of the sample, and such estimates may not be reliable. For these reasons, injury severity was based on length of coma, defined as the number of days until verbal commands were followed, combined with results from neuroimaging of the brain in acute care, consistent with previously established criteria, Donders, Tulsky, and Zhu, 2001. Patients with moderate, severe TBI, N equals 43, had evidence of an acute intracranial lesion in neuroimaging studies, N equals 38, or duration of coma of at least 24H, N equals 25, or both. Injuries were classified as mild, N equals 57, if there was no evidence of acute intracranial lesions on neuroimaging studies and coma was less than 24H. 20 of the 47 participants in the moderate, severe TBI group had also been included in a previous study that examined the psychometric characteristics of recall discriminability indices for the short and long, free and queued recall CDLT-2 variables, Donders and Inlinguis, in press. That particular study was based on a much smaller sample and did not include patients with mild TBI. After selection of the clinical sample, a demographically matched control group, N equals 100, was obtained from the CDLT-2 standardization sample. The control sample did not include any persons with self-reported neurological or psychiatric disorders, Delhi et al., 2000. Background characteristics of the complete clinical and control samples are presented in Table 1. 1.2. Procedure. The CDLT-2 was administered according to standardized procedures to clinical participants as part of a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. Almost all of the participants have been assessed as outpatients, with evaluations done on an inpatient basis only when it would have been unfeasible for them to return for evaluation as an outpatient, e.g., living in a remote area without reliable access to transportation. All of the participants were evaluated only when they were medically stable and could recall meaningful information from day to day. Clinical patients 18 years. 146 ML Jacobs, J. Donders/Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology 22, 2007, 143 to 149. And older provided informed consent, and participants under the age of 18 assented with the consent of their parents. CDLT-2 raw scores were converted to age and gender, corrected Z, N equals 0, SD equals 1, and T, N equals 50, SD equals 10, scores, using commercially available software, Delis and Fridland, 2000. 1.3 Materials. The CDLT-2 is an individually administered list learning task, which is used to examine several variables with regard to the ability to learn and remember verbally presented information. It also includes a forced choice trial administration that is intended to assess level of effort and motivation on the test. The main variables of interest for the purpose of this investigation were the following. The total A15 T-score reflects accurate recall over the 5 learning trials of the first list, and is most often used as a summary index of learning on the CDLT-2, with higher scores reflecting better performance. However, this index does not take into account recall errors. For this reason, the Z-score for the total number of intrusions across learning and recall trials was also considered. Higher scores reflect worse performance, i.e., more recall errors, on this variable. It was determined a priori that if there would be statistically significant group differences in terms of both accurate recall, total A1 and 5, T-score, and inaccurate recall, intrusions, subsequent analysis of diagnostic classification accuracy would focus on the Z-scores for the recall discriminability indices, which consider the balance of accurate and inaccurate recall. The recall discriminability indices take into account the total number of words recalled on a trial, possible number of target words, the number of intrusions reported, and the number of possible intrusions, 16. In this way, someone who has a large number of correct responses, but also has large number of intrusions will have a lower score than someone who has a large number of correct answers, but relatively few intrusions. Conversely, someone who recalls relatively few target words, but who also has relatively few intrusions will also have an impaired discriminability score, but it will not be as poor as that of someone who recalls few correct words and provides many intrusive errors, Delis et al. 2000. In addition, we plan to include in the analyses the Z-score for recognition discriminability index derived from the yes/no recognition trial, because it was considered possible that some patients might show improved performance under a recognition format, as opposed to free or semantically cued recall. Higher Z-scores reflect better performance for all discriminability variables. 1.4 Statistical analyses. Mean group differences on the CDLT-2 were evaluated with analysis of variance. In order to balance the risk of type I and type 2 errors with multiple comparisons, the step-down Bonferroni correction was applied to post-hoc contrasts. Covariances between selected variables were calculated with the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. Finally, classification accuracy was evaluated by means of logistic regression analysis. 2. Results. There were no statistically significant differences between the two clinical groups and the control group in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, dichotomized as Caucasian versus other, or educational attainment, P greater than 0.05 for all variables. This suggests that they were adequately matched on demographic characteristics. The difference in time since injury between the two TBI groups was also not statistically significant. F1 98 equals 2.19, P greater than 0.10, eta 2 equals 0.02. Since we did not include a minimum time since injury requirement in this study, we also computed correlations between time post-injury and the 4 dependent variables of interest, total A1 to 5, intrusions, total recall discriminability, and recognition discriminability in the complete clinical sample. None of these correlations were statistically significant, P greater than 0.10 for all variables. Table 2 presents the CDLT-2 results for the mild TBI, moderate, severe TBI, and control groups. Findings from the immediate and delayed, free and cued recall discriminability indices yielded virtually the same results as those for the total recall discriminability index. For reasons of brevity and clarity, only results from total recall discriminability are reported here. Inspection of Table 2 suggests that the moderate severe TBI group had relatively worse performance across all CDLT2 variables than the control group, with the mild TBI group taking an intermediate position. There were statistically significant main effects of group for total A15, F2, 197 equals 7.91, P less than 0.0005, eta 2 equals 0.07, as well as for intrusions, F2, 197 equals 8.83, P less than 0.0002, eta 2 equals 0.08. Given this combination of findings, we followed through. M.L. Jacobs, J. Donders/Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology 22, 2007, 143 to 149, 147. Table 2 means and standard deviations of control, N equals 100, mild TBI, N equals 57, and moderate severe TBI, N equals 43, groups for 4 CDLT2 variables. Variable control, mild, moderate, severe. Total A1, 5 T-score, M, SD, 51.50, 9.06, 49.97, 11.65, 44.07, 11.5, intrusion Z-score, M, SD, 0.04, 0.84, 0.40, 1.17, 0.85, 1.36, total recall discriminability Z-score, M, SD, 0.09, 0.93, minus 0.26, 1.18, minus 0.90, 1.26, recognition discriminability Z-score, M, SD, 0.18, 0.86, minus 0.31, 1.12, minus 0.61, 1.10. Note: TBI, traumatic brain injury. CDLT2, California Verbal Learning Test, 2nd edition. Control data are from the standardization sample of the California Verbal Learning Test, 2nd edition, CDLT2. Copyright 2000 by Hartford Assessment Incorporated, used with permission. All rights reserved. Table 3 classification accuracy, percent of selected CDLT2 variables. CDLT2 variable sensitivity specificity, false positives, false negatives. Total recall discriminability 74.42, 63.00, 53.62, 14.87, recognition discriminability 60.47, 75.00, 49.02, 18.48. Note: CDLT2, California Verbal Learning Test, 2nd edition. On our original plan to focus subsequent analyses on the total recall discriminability index, F2, 197 equals 12.48, P less than 0.0001, eta 2 equals 0.11, and the recognition discriminability index F2, 197 equals 10.56, P less than 0.0001, eta 2 equals 0.10. Post hoc contrasts with the step-down Bonferroni correction suggested that A, the moderate, severe TBI group performed statistically significantly worse than the control group on both total recall discriminability, F1, 141, equals 26.91, P less than 0.0006, eta 2 equals 0.16, and recognition discriminability, F1, 141, equals 20.87, P less than 0.0008, eta 2 equals 0.13, B. The performance of the moderate, severe TBI group was also statistically significantly worse than that of the mild TBI group on total recall discriminability, F1, 98, equals 6.61. P less than 0.04, eta 2 equals 0.06, but not on recognition discriminability, F1, 98, equals 1.76, P greater than 0.10, eta 2 equals 0.02, and C. The mild TBI group performed statistically significantly worse than the control group on recognition discriminability, F1, 155, equals 9.14. P less than 0.02, eta 2 equals 0.06, but not on total recall discriminability, F1, 155, equals 4.26, P less than 0.09, eta 2 equals 0.03. Because these two CDLT2 variables yielded somewhat different results, we evaluated their covariances in the clinical and control samples, as well as their respective sensitivities to length of coma in the complete clinical sample, N equals 100. Total recall discriminability and recognition discriminability were strongly correlated in patients with TBI, R equals 0.72, P less than 0.0001, and also in the control participants, R equals 0.66, P less than 0.0001, sharing, respectively, 51.84% and 43.56% of the variance. However, in the complete clinical sample, total recall discriminability demonstrated a statistically significant correlation with length of coma, R equals minus 0.21, P less than 0.04, whereas recognition discriminability did not. R equals minus 0.14, p greater than 0.10. For these reasons, we decided to include both variables in the subsequent analyses. We then used logistic regression analysis to determine how accurately these CDLT2 variables could classify IND. Visuals into the moderate, severe TBI, n equals 43, and control, n equals 100 groups. Analyses were run separately for total recall discriminability and recognition discriminability. These results are presented in Table 3. Total recall discriminability predicted group membership correctly 66.43% of the time, with a likelihood ratio of 2.01, whereas recognition discriminability classified 70.63% of these participants correctly, with a likelihood ratio of 2.42. These differences in total accuracy percentages were not statistically significant. Z equals 0.50, p greater than 0.10. Both variables were associated with relatively low false negative rates, but fairly high false positive rates. 3. Discussion. The purpose of this investigation was to determine the clinical utility of the CDLT2 in differentiating between patients with varying degrees of severity of TBI, and in discriminating such patients from demographically matched healthy controls. The results suggest that CDLT2 variables were moderately effective for this purpose at a group level, but not sufficiently accurate on an individual classification basis. Our first hypothesis was largely confirmed. Patients with moderate, severe TBI indeed obtained statistically significantly lower mean scores than the control group on both total recall discriminability and recognition discriminability. Furthermore, compared to the mild TBI group, the moderate, severe TBI group also performed worse, although this 148 ml Jacobs, J. Donders/Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology 22, 2007, 143 to 149. Difference was statistically significant only for total recall discriminability. Thus, in terms of mean group differences, especially the total recall discriminability index appeared to have considerable criterion validity. Support for our second hypothesis was more equivocal. As predicted, the average performance of patients with mild TBI was not statistically different from that of the control group on total recall discriminability. However, contrary to expectation, there was a statistically significant difference between the mild TBI group and the control group on recognition discriminability in favor of the latter group. It should be noted that this was a relatively small difference, and also that the performance of the mild TBI group on this variable was still within less than half a standard deviation from the normative mean. Furthermore, recognition discriminability did not correlate to a statistically significant degree with length of coma in the complete clinical sample, whereas total recall discriminability did. For these reasons, we conclude that the mean difference between the mild TBI group and the control group on recognition discriminability is of uncertain clinical significance. Replication in a much larger sample would be needed to determine if this finding might reflect the presence of a small subgroup of people with mild TBI with subtle cognitive residuals. With regard to the classification accuracy of the CDLT2 variables, we had set an a priori criterion that, in order to be clinically significant, the CDLT2 should have a likelihood ratio greater than or equal to 2. When discriminating between patients with moderate, severe TBI and control participants, both total recall discriminability and recognition discriminability met this criterion, suggesting that these CDLT2 variables have the minimal required value in the diagnostic process. However, a concerning finding was that both variables were associated with large proportions of false positives. In fact, approximately half of all the positive classifications, 37 to 69, for total recall discriminability and 25/51 for recognition discriminability applied to individuals from the demographically matched control group. This is likely related to the fact that, as seen in Table 2, there was a considerable amount of overlap in the scores between the control group and the moderate, severe TBI group. Thus, in clinical circumstances where the base rate of moderate, severe TBI is similar to that in the current study, 0.30, 43/143, the CDLT2 may have adequate negative predictive value, but problematic positive predictive value. Of course, it needs to be realized that negative and positive predictive accuracies are strongly affected by base rates, Rosenfeld, Sands, and Van Gorp, 2000. Lower base rates would be associated with even higher false positive rates. This is concerning because it is estimated that, of all cases of TBI that occur annually, only about 10 to 20% involve moderate or severe injuries. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 2006, Thurman, Alverson, Dunn, Guerrero, and Smezek, 1999. Our findings suggest that total recall discriminability is the CDLT2 variable with the clearest criterion validity in terms of sensitivity to severity of TBI. However, this variable misclassified an unacceptably large number of the demographically matched control participants. For these reasons, The CDLT2 should not be used in isolation to determine the likelihood of acquired neurocognitive dysfunction. This caution may be especially important in medical legal contexts involving cases of mild TBI, where other complicating factors are often influential. Binder and Rowling, 1996. Green, Rowling, Lee-Haley, and Allen, 2001. Potential limitations of the present investigation should also be considered. The clinical participants were recruited from a referred convenience sample at a rehabilitation hospital. This may have led to the inclusion of relatively more patients with serious neurological injuries than if they had been selected from consecutive emergency room admissions. At the same time, this also guaranteed a broad range of injury severity, which reduced the probability of unreliable findings due to restriction of range. The clinical sample was also limited largely to Caucasian individuals from the Midwest. Therefore, replication with a more ethnically and geographically diverse sample would be desirable. With these limitations in mind, the findings from this investigation indicate that when combined with additional neuropsychological test data, patient history, and behavioral observations, the CDLT2 may be clinically useful. However, due to low positive predictive accuracy, the CDLT2 should never be used in isolation to determine the presence or absence of acquired memory impairment or brain injury. Future research should investigate the possibility of different subtypes of impairment of learning and memory, as assessed by the CDLT2 after TBI. Another goal for future research is to determine the degree to which CDLT2 variables add incremental value above neurological and demographic variables in the prediction of longer-term outcome after TBI. Acknowledgements. This research was supported by a grant from the Campbell Foundation and was based Asterisk address correspondence to Yin Wook Kong, Department of Neurology, Samsung Medical Center, 50 Ilwin Dong Hangnam Pu, Seoul 135 to 710, Korea. Tel, +822-3410-3598. Email, eking7@smc.samsung.co.k are accepted for publication, November 11, 1998. The clinical neuropsychologist 1385-4046/99/1303-365 $15.00 1999, volume 13, number 3, pages 365 to 369. Copyright Sweat and Seidlinger. Brief report. Normative study of the Korean California verbal learning test, KCDLT, asterisk. Young Tae, Kim Won and Yin Wook Kong, 2-1 Pohang University of Science and Technology, Pohang, Korea, and 2 Samsung Medical Center, Seoul, Korea. Abstract. As a normative study of the Korean version of the California Verbal Learning Test, KCDLT, the present study examined the KCDLT performances of 357 neurologically intact Koreans, 181 males and 176 females, who were selected by stratified sampling reflecting the recent Korean census data. The factor analysis of the KCDLT showed that the KCDLT was a valid and useful tool for qualitatively assessing a number of theoretically meaningful processes and strategies underlying verbal memory. Norms were developed on the 22 memory indices separately for gender and age groups. Implications for the KCDLT's factor analytic results are discussed, and the KCDLT's normative data is compared with that of the CDLT. Assessment of memory is an essential aspect in the evaluation of cognitive functions not only in clinical settings, but also in the experimental research of normal memory. Considering the strong need for a standardized memory test in Korea, we developed the Korean version of the California Verbal Learning Test, KCDLT. While following the same logic of the CDLT, Deli, Kramer, Kaplan, and Ober, 1987, the KCDLT is a unique Korean memory test which consists of newly selected stimulus items and instructions reflecting Korean language and culture. As a preliminary study for the KCDLT development, we had explored the reliability and the validity of the test, Kim and Kong, 1994-1995. In the present study, we developed norms for the KCDLT by testing a larger group of participants selected by unbiased stratified sampling from the Korean population. Method. Construction of the KCDLT. Rather than presenting a list of randomly selected words to remember, the CDLT measures various cognitive processes of learning and memory in the context of an everyday memory task by giving the to-be-remembered words in a shopping list format, Monday and Tuesday lists. Following the basic principles of the CDLT, we reconstructed the KCDLT considering the cultural and language differences between Korean and American people. Although shopping is an everyday routine for Americans regardless of age and gender, in Korea familiarity of shopping is different for people depending on their age, gender, and other social and cultural factors. In order to motivate all of our participants to organize the stimulus items, Leolabo rated the instructions by telling the participants to suppose that they have just moved to a new location and they need to buy some items in a market or a department store on Monday. Then, on Tuesday, they need to go shopping again to buy more. Items. 366 Yoon K, Kim and Yin Wook Kong. Table 1. Exemplar frequency and typicality of words on List A and List B. List A, Monday, List B, Tuesday. Word exemplar frequency typicality, word exemplar frequency typicality. Wardrobe chair, dressing table. Cabbage, carrot, pumpkin, bean sprouts. Fountain pen sign, pen, eraser, color pencil. Stimulus items, words of the KCDLT, CTOBLE 1, were selected as follows. 6 semantic categories, furniture, fish, vegetables, writing tools, flowers, and shoes, of words meeting the follow IMG criteria were selected. 1. Items should be EASIly available in a market or a department store in Korea. 2. Items should be familiar in everyday Korean life to all age, gender, socioeconomic class groups. And 3. Items from each category should be similar in terms of their exemplar frequency and typicality. Lee, 1991. 2 of the categories, furniture and vegetables, are shared categories, which are included in both Monday and Tuesday lists. The other 4 categories are non-shared categories, fish and writing tools on Monday list, flowers and shoes on Tuesday list. The 2, Monday and Tuesday, lists were constructed by selecting 4 words from each of the 4 semantic categories. No 2 consecutive words were from the same semantic category. The mean values for the 2 lists were not signified. Can't be different from each other for either exam. Flaw frequency, T30 equals 0.08 ns, or typicality, T30 equals 0.77 ns, Table 1. Participants, the KCDLT was administered to 357 individuals, 181 males and 176 females, who did not have neurological or psychiatric illness. The participants were selected by stratified sampling reflect IMG the recent Korean census data, Korean Census Bureau, 1993, 1994, in terms of age, gender, residente area, and education level. The range of the participants' age was divided into 6 groups, ages 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 69, 70 to 79. The number of participants in each education level, 0, 0 EDU 6, 6 EDU 9, 9 EDU 12, and EDU 12, was also proportional to the national distribution of Korean population. Procedure: each participant was individually tested on the KCDLT by a master's or doctoral level psychologist during the 20-minute interval between shores. Normative study of the KCDLT 367. Table 2. Correct recall scores across 5 trials. List A. Total male-female. Age, years, NM, SD, NM, SD, NM, SD. 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 69, 70 to 79 total. 160, 159, 156, 162, 164, 156, 357. 54.05, 50.68, 51.16, 44.08, 36.95, 32.52, 45.03. 11.30, 10.56, 10.83, 10.25, 10.98, 11.18, 13.25. 130, 130, 127, 130, 134, 130, 181. 51.83, 45.83, 46.96, 40.57, 34.62, 28.40, 41.13. 10.90, 10.43, 10.25, 1, 7.93, 10.19, 1, 9.41, 12.58. 130, 129, 129, 132, 130, 126, 176. 56.27, 55.69, 55.07, 47.38, 39.60, 37.27, 48.71. 11.45, 8.21, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 10.00, asterisk, asterisk. Other existing memory tests, such as the Wechsler memory scale. For variables, see Table 3, showed loadings on the second factor, response discrimination, which reflects the ability to differentiate relevant, correct, from irrelevant, incorrect. responses. The response discrimination was shown to be useful for diagnosing different clinical patients. Kramer et al., 1988. Proactive interference effect was the third factor, with loading on list B versus list to trial 1 recall. It is well known that while interference is a fundamental characteristic of normal memory, some amnesic patients are more vulnerable to the interference effect. The fourth factor was serial position effect, with significant loading on three variables of percent primacy recall, percent recency recall, and serial clustering ratio. Retroactive interference effect was the fifth FAC. TOR on which the variable of short delay versus trial 5 recall loaded. The sixth factor, with load ING on the variable of learning slope, was named as learning rate. The present results of factor analysis confirm that the KCDLT is a valid and useful tool for qualitatively assessing a number of theoretically meaningful processes and strategies underlying verbal memory. Normative data, the KCDLT, the present study provides the normative data on the KCDLT's 22 memory indices separately for gender and age groups, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 69, and 70 to 79, based on the performances of 357 participants selected by stratified sampling reflecting the recent Korean census data in terms of gender, age, and Adupa type, Kim and Kong, in press. Normative study for the KCDLT 369. By comparing the KCDLT normative data with the CDLT, we found that the CDLT norms, Delis et al., 1987, were generally inflated compared to the KCDLT norms. And the standard deviation scores of memory indices for each gender/age group were lower in the CDLT than those in the KCDLT. These differences seem to come from somewhat biased sampling of the CDLT. The CDLT's norms were based on the non-clinical reference group of 273 participants who volunteered for research projects in 4 U.S. cities, and the participants' mean educational level was 13.83 years, which seems too high to represent the U.S. national population. The problem-inflated norms for the CDLT have been also mentioned in other studies: Elwood, 1995, Stalling, Boe, and Scherer, 1995, Wien, Tyndall, and Crossan, 1994. References: Delis, D. C., Kramer, J. H., Kaplan, E., and Ober, B. A. 1987. The California Verbal Learning